industry for a while now, and just really happy to be able to be here to present in person. And obviously, thank you to everybody who's on Zoom as well. I was just curious if I could get a show of hands before we start of how many of you have either heard of Millie or knew her directly. Okay, so about half have a pretty close connection, and then the other half might not know as much. Okay, good to know. I was not able to see on the screen with the Zoom, but I'll assume that it might be about half and half. So I won't assume any previous knowledge, but yeah. So we'll get right down to it. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then I really would love to hear questions and stories about Millie and her husband, Jean, who she worked very closely with. So if you have questions, I would say either put them in the chat and we can get to them later, unless it's super duper pertinent to exactly what we're talking about. Maybe we can save them to the end. But feel free to raise your hand. If there's a hand question on Zoom, I don't know, whoever's helping with that, you might want to wait until.
We'll wait.
Okay.
Get ready.
Okay, awesome. All right. Let's see. Okay, so who was Mildred Dresselhaus? For those of you who don't know, she was a longtime scientist and engineer, material scientist, physicist. She was many things at MIT for about 50 years. She was nicknamed the Queen of Carbon or Queen of Carbon Science for her work elucidating many of the properties of carbon, which until she had come along, and obviously other people worked with her, but she was one of the leading people who helped us understand the inner workings of carbon. I'm showing you on the right a number of carbon allotropes or forms. We might see carbon every day in our lives and not think too much about it. Obviously, carbon is the stuff of life, so we're all made of carbon. It's in everything, but many kids and just general adults don't necessarily realize that, diamonds, for example, which is the letter A here, are the same exact thing in terms of makeup as graphite, the graphite that you might find in a pencil, which is the letter B, just in a slightly different arrangement of atoms. So Millie helped discover individual properties about heat transfer, electricity transfer within carbon systems. And for this, she was well renowned around the world. She was not necessarily a household name just generally, but within the scientific community, she was well known, and especially in the physics community, she was well known. She was also someone who did a lot of community service, meaning science service, national service. She did a lot of work at MIT behind the scenes, but she also very much was a leader in terms of science policy. And we'll get a little more into some of the things that she did during her life. So on the left here, you'll see this is in 2014. This is Barack Obama presenting her with the National Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian award that you can win in the United States, along with, I believe, the Congressional Gold Medal. So she was the only scientist in the room winning that award that day. The other people who were there were, politicians, artists, singers, very famous people. Millie might have been one of the least famous household names there, but she was no less someone who was deserving of this award. And President Obama that day noted that, her work is seen all around us in the cars we drive, in the batteries in our laptops, and we might not know about it, but one of the reasons why he wanted to honor her was just because of how influential her work has been in science and engineering. Okay, so Millie was born in 1930 in Brooklyn, New York. She originally lived very close to the Brooklyn Bridge, and I had a very fun time writing my book about her, trying to figure out exactly where she lived. Her family told me that she lived somewhere near the base of the bridge, but I was able to mine old photos from tax records and things like that of the city of New York, and was able to find like the exact building where she lived, which no longer exists. Most of the area near the Brooklyn Bridge where she used to live looked completely different back in the early 30s than it does now. I actually used to live in Brooklyn Heights myself before I moved here to Massachusetts, and can tell you that there's basically one standing building left there, and you would have no idea. The whole area looks completely different. So anyway, she lived there. That's just kind of a fun tidbit. She lived there for only a few years, but her brother Irving was a child prodigy on the violin, and he was able to secure an apprenticeship with someone who lived out in the Bronx. So their family at the time, and this is a family who her parents were immigrants from originally the Poland area. A lot of the geographical boundaries had been shifting during that time in Europe. And luckily, Millie's parents got out and came to the United States just in time. Basically, the rest of her family perished, at the hands of the Nazis during the Holocaust. So they came over to the United States and started a new life, but this was also the time of the Great Depression. So they didn't have a lot of resources. They actually owned a small candy shop in Brooklyn, a newsstand that had sold candy and newspapers and things like this. But because Millie's brother was interested in music and was gifted in music, they decided to move to the Bronx, where his teacher was going to give him lessons for free. And they thought they would really wanted to take that opportunity. Unfortunately, as soon as they moved to the Bronx, this teacher died. I don't really know the story. Nobody really knows the exact story of what happened to him, but and so they had used up all their resources to move to the Bronx. And so all of a sudden now they were stuck, and they had to try to find some other situation for her brother to take lessons. And so they found another music school back in Manhattan. So they ended up doing a lot of commuting anyway. And Millie showed aptitude in music as well at an early age. So she was a tag along with her brother to these free music lessons that she got down in Greenwich Village at the Greenwich House School of Music, which was a very influential part of her life. Through this music school, she met a lot of people who knew about higher education and opportunities that in her home neighborhood in the Bronx, kids and students and teachers really just didn't offer her and didn't know so much about. So this picture on the left is her in her junior high in the Bronx. But honestly, she really loved going around the city and learning things through her music school that she also not only was learning how to play the violin, but she was also given opportunities to go watch movies and go to museums and things and write up reports about them for her music school. So she sort of had like two places where she had to be scholastically. There was her junior high, and you can tell she sort of does not have the greatest, happiest look over here because she didn't particularly enjoy being there because most of the time the kids were rowdy. And she said many times later that, people weren't necessarily there to learn. They were just, the teachers had a hard enough time just keeping order. So she didn't really learn that much. And yet at her music school, she was able to blossom, and she learned about being able to apply for some of the magnet schools in New York City. Only one really was open to girls at that time. And that was the Hunter College High School in Manhattan. And so the teachers in her junior high really did not teach her anything that she would have needed to know to pass the entrance exam. But she was interested enough that she took out books from the library, studied her head off, and she actually aced the exam and got into Hunter High. And so on the right, this is her picture from her high school graduation. I'm not going to skip over too much, but she had a wonderful time in high school. It was another major turning point for her. She started really being interested in science and mathematics. She became a tutor in especially mathematics because she was a math whiz, but she also would teach anyone anything. And she used to say that she could get an A for any student who came along. And this actually became a way for her to help her family get out of some pretty destitute situations. Sometimes her family had trouble putting food on the table. And sometimes she actually had to work in, she was a child laborer in a zipper factory for some summers. Her mom ended up being the breadwinner most of the time because her dad was unwell. And so, she had kind of a rough life in high school, but she was able to, through her tutoring, actually earn a significant amount of money to become almost financially independent of her parents, which was like a huge thing. And it also gave her an opportunity to learn how to teach. And at the time, she said many times over the years afterwards that girls were not really expected to have professions beyond a few possible ones. And the ones she always said that they were offered to her were, she could be a secretary, she could learn to be a teacher, or a nurse. And of those three options, she identified teaching as something that she thought she would be good at. And she took as many math and science classes as she could, but at that time, it was really impossible for her to envision a career in science or engineering, certainly, because there was no expectations for that, and there were very few role models. So even though she had a few things that she, could look at, like for instance, she loved reading National Geographic magazine. She read Marie Curie's biography by Marie Curie's daughter, Eve, but still, she just couldn't sense that she herself might be able to go into science because there just wasn't any way for that to happen. And so this is sort of like a quip for the ages in terms of her yearbook quote: "Any equation she can solve, every problem she can resolve. Mildred equals brains plus fun in math and science. She's second to none." So she graduated top of her class, and she earned scholarships and things, but she didn't even apply to other colleges. Basically, if you go to Hunter High, you're automatically accepted to Hunter College, which is also in New York. And so she just assumed that college meant going to Hunter College. She had gotten a scholarship to Cornell, but she didn't even apply. Again, people in her school really didn't think that they didn't tend to afford opportunities or really encourage people who didn't have means. And so she felt, since her family was pretty poor, that she just wouldn't have a way to pay for college, so she didn't bother applying. So it actually turned out to be a really good thing in the end, but it's just interesting how different things are now.
What year was this?
She graduated high school, and I think it was 47 or 48. I have to double check, but yeah, it was late 40s. Okay, so at Hunter, say it again. She graduated very early. Yes, young. I'll also mention she had some time. She suffered from pertussis, or whooping cough. And she had like almost a whole year where she didn't go to school. So she graduated early and she missed a whole bunch of school. So she was really precocious, and to have done that all together was pretty remarkable already. Okay, so she entered Hunter College thinking that she was going to major in mathematics and mathematics education. So Hunter College was not a place where there was any focus on scientific research. So there was certainly a science department, but they weren't particularly sophisticated in educating, scientists of the day. In part, Hunter College was, it was certainly co-educational, but there were relatively more women there at, say, other colleges at the time. But certainly, again, women were not encouraged to go into mathematics or anything like that. So in her second year, she met Rosalind Yallow, who at the left is about the age that she would have been when she met Millie. And then the later picture, they ended up becoming, staying in touch for many, many decades. And this is, I think, the only other picture that the family has of them together. But so Rosalind Yallow ended up becoming a biophysicist who, as some of you may know, also she won a Nobel Prize for I think it was her radio immunoassay work. She worked for many years in her research field, but for the longest time she was not able to find a direction. She was a nuclear scientist originally, and she got her PhD in nuclear science and was kind of flailing about trying to find some place that would hire her as a scientist. And she was having a difficult time. This was shortly after the war. Former soldiers were coming back and sort of taking back the jobs that they used to have before they went off to fight or do whatever they were doing. She was also Jewish, so that was kind of another strike against her. And of course, she was a woman, which was probably, in my view, the biggest strike against her at that time. So at Hunter, she was sort of treading water to try to figure out what her next move was going to be. So she was an adjunct professor in physics. And as soon as she met Millie, it was like, Millie said that it was like a love at first sight. They were instant mentor mentees. They were 10 years apart, but they shared many things in common. And Rosalind really saw herself in Millie. And she basically insisted that Millie needed to forget the idea of going to become a high school math teacher and said, you really should do research. You have the aptitude, and you can do this. This is a career you can do. So she very much encouraged her in many different ways. And that was, Rosalind was one of her life's biggest mentors. And she was someone who really, we probably wouldn't be talking about Mildred Dresselhaus right now if it wasn't for Rosalind encouraging her in this way. So that was definitely an important part. So Millie ultimately, I think she changed her major to physical sciences, although it was kind of a generic major, is my understanding. And she wasn't 100% sure what her forward path was going to be, but she was able to secure several avenues for advanced study following her graduation. One of which was, so she ultimately decided to go through two of the paths. One opportunity was at MIT to work at the Lincoln Lab, to work on the Whirlwind computer and some of the early systems that Lincoln was working on. I'm sure some of you guys, if not have worked directly at Lincoln, know all about that. Millie ended up not taking up that opportunity, but as we all know, she found her way to MIT later and would spend the rest of her career there. The two other opportunities she had after college were a Fulbright fellowship at the Cavendish in the UK, and that would have been in physics. And then the other opportunity was to do an advanced degree in physics at Harvard through Radcliffe. At the time, she was dating someone who was about to make his career over at Harvard or get a PhD, I guess, over there. And so that she did want to do that, but she also was very strongly drawn to the idea of traveling and going back to Europe. When she was growing up, her family was so poor, they never had any opportunities to really explore or do anything like that. So that ultimately was how she decided to study physics at the Cavendish for a year. And Harvard or Radcliffe agreed to let her wait an extra year and start her program after that. So she ultimately did two of the three opportunities. So briefly, on the left is Millie with her boyfriend, who actually became her first husband. She was married to him briefly. His name was Frederick Wright. He was also a physicist. They had many things in common. They both loved music. Their family was from the same part of the world. Millie did not talk much about this relationship. And we'll talk a lot more about Millie's later husband, who she worked with directly. But it seems pretty clear to me that, she did say that she wanted to follow, this person over to Harvard. And later, she ultimately ended up going to the University of Chicago for her PhD, which is where Fred got for his first teaching position. So it seems a little bit obvious to me. It's not 100% confirmed that there was some, help along the way from Fred, and he was highly influential in helping her, encouraging her, and possibly even, helping open doors for her in ways that other people might not have been able to. And so she completed her PhD at the University of Chicago. In the first year, she was connected with another Nobel laureate who was a major influence in her life, Enrico Fermi, who I'm sure most of you know, was another Nobel laureate in physics. And this actually ultimately was that last year of his life. So sadly, she only knew him for a year because he ended up dying. He had cancer. But he was influential in a number of ways for her. She, first of all, was the only woman in the physics department as a graduate student at the time, and there were very few women overall. There actually were a few influential women at the time. Maria Gilbert-Meyer was still there. She was also a Nobel laureate. And she actually roomed with Millie for, I think, a year or something like that, which is a really interesting tidbit that I had not known before I wrote the book. But for the most part, Millie was still, very unique in being a woman pursuing physics at this level. And Fermi was very encouraging of not only women, but also young people in general. And his, he would actually talk with Millie as they walked to school. He would like take the opportunity and like, say, let's chat. And, they got to know each other on these walks to school. And Millie always really encouraged her later students in a way that sort of mirrored how Fermi really, embraced listening to young students and giving them an opportunity to shine and like letting them, really blossom, I guess, in ways that other professors really just wanted to do their thing and, wanted to stick to the rigid hierarchies of academia. So Fermi also taught her about being a scientist who obviously, had a very strong foundation in the field of their interest, but also having a broad understanding of their area, such that if they ever had some kind of pivot in their career, or if there were a new challenge that they needed to take on, they would be able to, understand a little bit about whatever the broad field was talking about, and then, not get so focused down on their individual area of specialty that it would be basically difficult for them to do anything else. So that came in handy for Millie a number of times in her career as well. And she regularly would talk about how Fermi taught her how to think like a physicist. And, later in Millie's career, when she was doing, national service and working with people that were outside of her field, let's say, she said that Fermi really encouraged this sensibility where she could, be able to have conversations, like intelligent conversations about kind of many different disciplines. And that was another thing that he learned from her, or she learned from him, rather. So, as I mentioned, Millie's relationship with Reich was pretty brief, and they parted ways at some point. And while she was still at University of Chicago, she met, the person who would be the love of her life, and basically her partner for the rest of her life in every possible aspect. And that was Mildred Dresselhaus, who is at the left here. Jean was a theoretical physicist, also in solid state physics. And he really encouraged her in so many different ways. This is them at Cornell, where Jean took on his first assistant professorship. And Millie was able to get a postdoc there after college, or after her PhD program. And, one of the stories that really resonated with me when I was writing this book is that after Millie's 2-year postdoc, it was an NSF postdoc, after the funding ran out, Cornell refused to hire Millie. At the time, anti-nepotism rules were very prevalent in academia, and Millie even offered to do physics for free, and she was, stellar at what she was doing. She had done her PhD on superconductivity, and yet, and had actually gotten some really interesting papers out of it. But unfortunately, Cornell at the time, they just were not interested. When she first joined the Cornell team that Jean was a part of, their advisor had been encouraging of her, but he left shortly after she arrived. So that was kind of a difficult situation. So Jean ultimately decided, along with Millie, that, you know what, if we're going to have a career together, and I want you to have a career, I'm going to have to leave this job. And, that was a big thing to do, to just leave this wonderful academic position. It's very hard to get on the tenure track. But he, to his great credit, he saw how brilliant Millie was at this point. And so, they really were a team moving forward. So, they ultimately had 2 job offers to be able to work together, both as physicists. And one was from IBM Research. They thought long and hard about possibly going to live in New York, where the research, they were just starting this new TJ Watson Center, which is close to where I grew up. And they ultimately decided that they were going to settle here, and their competing offer was from Lincoln Lab. And they were offered an opportunity through Ben Lax, who was the head of the solid state division at that time, So he was happy to have Jean or other women who, could make the grade, work with his group. And so they did that. And so Jean and Millie worked together at the beginning, starting in 1960 at Lincoln Lab in the solid state division. And just a brief note, also at this time, Millie and Jean started their family. And that was a very important thing for Millie. She really wanted to not only have a career in science, but also wanted to have a big family. So this is her in the lab. I think this was at Cornell still. This is when her daughter, Marianne, was born. That was their oldest child. And, this was well before daycare centers would exist at a place like Lincoln or at any kind of college. There was no maternity leave, it was a totally different time. And so to make ends meet, Millie and Jean ultimately did hire a nanny who helped for a great deal for about 30 years in their life. But even in the beginning of their career, it was hard to juggle everything. And so Millie brought her daughter to the lab. So I don't know what she's doing here exactly, but she's working on some experiment and her daughter's just sleeping away soundly. The family would go on to include 4 kids. And Millie's here with Jean, as well as their 4 children and Millie's parents. So this is a little bit later on. So let's talk a little bit about Millie's science. When Millie got to Lincoln Lab, she at first didn't know what area she was going to be working on. As I mentioned, she did her PhD thesis on superconductivity, but her boss, Ben Lax, felt that this was around the time when the BCS theory of superconductivity, which was sort of ultimately would win a Nobel Prize and is generally how we understand superconductivity these days. Her boss basically was like, well, we've finished that problem. It's all solved. So I don't want you to work on superconductivity. You can do anything else, but not superconductivity. At the time as well, many engineers were working on and scientists were working on the physics that would be required to create new computing machines. Obviously, computing was something that was really just up and coming. So there was a lot of underlying physics that still had to be worked out. Many of Millie and Jean's colleagues at Lincoln were working on semiconductors. And Millie looked into semiconductors a little bit when she first got there, but was not super impressed. I guess she felt that the semiconducting systems, like from one, element to another, were fairly similar. And frankly, there was a lot of competition. Everybody else was working on semiconductors. So long story short, she started looking into semi-metals instead. And so Jean at one point suggested that she look into carbon, which he had studied previously in a couple of cases and suspected that there might be some really interesting and intriguing physics going on there. Carbon at the time was considered a very difficult or labyrinthine system. And so Millie saw this as a bit of a challenge. And at the same time, as I mentioned, she was raising a family of 4 kids. They were all very young. So the carbon system afforded her both an opportunity to do something that nobody else was doing. And so it was a little bit less pressure. And also, if she made some interesting discoveries, she would have an opportunity to be at the forefront of that new field. And then also, if her kid was sick one day and she had to take a day off or whatever, work from home, if that was even possible, I'm not sure, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So she started working on graphite, specifically something called graphite intercalation compounds. And I'll explain that in a second. So basically on the left here is, on the A one model is diamond and B is graphite. So basically graphite is made of layers of carbon atoms that are arranged in a hexagonal shape, I guess. There's obviously very different, you could just see the differences based on this very crude interpretation of the setup. But the differences are, they go well beyond just visual differences. Electronic properties, heat properties, magnetic properties are very different from one to another. And so today we know that graphene, which is considered one of these individual layers that are stacked up to make graphite, can be separated and we can work with it. And there are some really interesting things that are being done with graphene right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But at the time, there was no way to really study the individual layers. The technology was not really there and the science just wasn't there. So one of the things Millie was really worked closely on was trying to sort of jimmy apart the layers of graphite to be able to figure out what happens if you put other materials inside them. And they found some really interesting things, many different other molecules or atoms they tried putting in between. And they found some really interesting things about, what would happen to various properties if you, mix this in this way, or if you, put it in something else. So they started just like, in the book, I talk about it being like a bakery. They just started like trying all these different recipes and seeing what would happen. And they were really laying the foundations of like, the kind of science that would be necessary to understand what you could do further with these kinds of materials. So I'm going to take a quick pause in terms of her science, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But I just wanted to say that after about 7 years, I think it was 7 years at Lincoln, she definitely faced her share of discrimination over the years for being a woman. And one of the most famous was when she was a PhD student, her advisor at the time, who was not Fermi, it was another person, really felt that educating women in science was a waste of time because they would go off and get married and have families, and then that would be the end. And so her advisor felt that way, and he basically just told her to get lost so many times that she just did, and she just basically did her PhD program all by herself, and with the help of others certainly, but not with the help of her advisor, and that was difficult. It was also difficult for her not to be able to find a job after her postdoc. But at Lincoln, it was difficult for her because at a certain point, they changed the hour requirements such that you had to clock in and out at very specific times, especially in the morning where she had young kids. It was really difficult. It was almost impossible for her to get to Lincoln at 8 a.m. when, like not her daycare, but like her nanny or whatever couldn't start until whatever time. So she was an extremely diligent worker. She was brilliant. And yet she was hassled about coming in late. Even if she came in with Gene at the same time, he wouldn't get hassled about it, but she would. And she felt very stuck because she just wanted to do the science and not be hassled about coming in late half an hour, even though she would take her work home and work at night all the time. And, nobody was giving her credit for that. So eventually she ended up deciding to try to do something else. And somebody suggested, there's a professorship at MIT that has specifically been earmarked for women. And it was funded by one of the Rockefeller family. It was the daughter of the Rockefellers, Abby Mose Rockefeller. Millie applied for that position and got it immediately. So it was a visiting position in the Department of Electrical Engineering at MIT. And she was, happy to find a place that was happy to have her, but also give her a little bit of flexibility to just have her own personal life as well. Meanwhile, Jean stayed on at Lincoln, and so they saw each other, and they continued to work together on certain projects, but it wasn't quite as close a collaboration as when they were in the same place. And so when Millie joined the MIT faculty, this was in 1967, her fellow faculty members and her students in particular felt that she was so amazing at teaching. Her primary responsibility was teaching, in addition to her research, of course, was teaching engineering students the physics they would know to create whatever they're working on. And so, she had students who had said that this was the best teacher we've ever had, and they petitioned to get her contract essentially extended so she would become a full faculty member. And so within 1 year, she was offered a full professorship without having to go through tenure track, with tenure, right off the bat. And so to me, that was really extraordinary. I mean, even today, the most brilliant minds still have to go through tenure. And so, this was also a time when society was changing. And there were some pressures to add women to schools. MIT actually was one of the first colleges that accepted women. But it was very haphazard and ad hoc until the late 60s and 70s when they started really focusing on encouraging women to apply. And Millie, and as I'll talk about, played a little bit of a role in that. But yeah, so Millie started in 1968 as a full professor. She was the first woman on the engineering faculty. She was, I think, only the second woman after Sheila Whitnall in the entire School of Engineering. And you know, this picture over here from 1970 is her at a carbon conference in Japan. And of course, she's the only woman there as well. And I just, you know, there's some websites that have pictures of like the only women scientists in the room. And there's like a famous one of Marie Curie, and there's a famous one of Ellen Swallow Richards, she was the first woman who attended MIT. And then I love this one as well. So it just gives you a sense of how barrier breaking she was. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit back to her science. So one of the things, so Millie continued working in carbon. She definitely worked on other systems as well, but carbon was something that really drew her attention, and she just stuck with it along with Jean. Again, they weren't always working together on the same papers, but they would go home and talk about the same stuff. They would, you know, collaborate sometimes, and they were certainly partners in terms of just bouncing ideas off each other. So in the 1980s, a new form of carbon was discovered that had not been previously known, and that is the Buckminster fullerene, which is seen on the right. It was named after Buckminster Fuller, who, as many of you know, instigated the development of geodesic domes. So this is really looks like a soccer ball as well. It was nicknamed the buckyball, and Millie did not discover buckyballs, but she definitely helped in the discovery of them. The discovery did ultimately go on to earn a Nobel Prize for a trio of chemists at Rice University, excuse me. But before that, Millie had been she had been experimenting with irradiating carbon with lasers, which is, she performed some of the very first experiments with laser light and carbon. And they were finding some interesting things about what was flying off when this happened. And scientists, you know, that were just starting to work on carbon were interested in this. In particular, in the energy sector, they were looking at these things to try to figure out how they might be used for energy purposes. And so this particular work right here on the left, this spectrum, is a precursor spectrum to the discovery of the buckyballs. So basically, originally when folks were firing lasers at the carbon atoms, they were doing so with like small chunks of carbon. And Millie was saying, no, I think you should really look at larger chunks, because what we're finding in our lab is we're getting these large molecules and we don't really know anything about them, but like they're getting our lab equipment all black and they're just totally not what we expect. And she encouraged scientists at Exxon Research, for example, to really think about, trying to, imagine what larger molecules could be coming off of this stuff. And so here you see the large spike at C60, and that actually does correspond to the number of atoms that are in a buckyball. There's 60 carbon atoms. And although nobody at the time of the publication of this this particular spectrum knew exactly what they were seeing, it was, sort of later reinforcement for other experiments that, unambiguously showed that C60 existed. Again, at the time, they also didn't know the form that it took, and eventually the folks that won the Nobel figured out that it was this icosahedral module. Or is it icosahedral or dodecahedral? I forget. I think it's icosahedral. But anyway, so again, Millie did not win a Nobel Prize for this discovery, but she was definitely one of the people who was thinking about it, working on it, and helped enable this discovery. Now, in the intervening years, we haven't had a ton of applications of buckyballs, but they were very important because they started the discussion of carbon nanotubes, which are essentially extended buckyballs that have actually become extremely important. And we'll get into that in a second. So carbon nanotubes are these tiny pipes that are essentially pieces of graphene rolled into a tube with the sort of halves of a buckyball on either end, essentially. Or that's how people started thinking about it. Like Millie and other colleagues, but especially Millie in one particular case, and I mentioned this in the book, we're at a conference and people were starting to think like, well, what would happen if you just started elongating a buckyball? What would that do, and what would it do in terms of the structure of the whatever you get out of it, and also what would it mean in terms of the properties of this thing, and could that be useful in some way? So again, Millie was not the very first person to think about it, but she helped reframe some of these big questions that led to the ultimate isolation of carbon nanotubes. Now, carbon nanotubes today are used in many different applications. There's probably some carbon nanotubes in the batteries in this laptop right here. They've been used for mechanical uses in airplanes to make them stronger and lighter. So nanotubes are extremely highly efficient at forcing electricity through them, and they're also very, very strong. So they have extreme high strength. They're very light. They're when you separate them out, they're actually like invisible. And so they're just this really interesting system that you can apply to many different things. Sporting equipment, sensors for various noxious chemicals, medical applications where you're trying to deliver drugs in certain ways. I mean, seriously, the list goes on and on. I think I spent an entire page just like single space listing like a whole bunch of applications. And many of these applications of carbon nanotubes, and later with graphene, and now we're starting to see some newer forms of carbon, are a little bit invisible to us, partly because they're super small. This is the nanoscale, but also just because they're sort of components of things that we see. It's not like a giant tree that you cut down and make a building out of, and you're like, oh, that's the tree that made this. You just don't really have a sense of where this carbon is coming from or what it would even look like. So it's not quite as sexy as maybe some other parts of physics where you're, thinking of like astronomy. I see the stars over there. Like I can put two and two together. There's a star in the sky, or there's a galaxy, or even these days, there's a black hole. We can actually see it now. This is a little bit different. And so, my interest in this particular story about Millie and her work is, trying to illuminate something that has been difficult for, I think, a lot of people to really understand. So anyway, carbon nanotubes, they come in many, this on the left, you can see sort of the different scales here. Carbon nanotubes are slightly different from nanofibers, which are, order of magnitude bigger, and then carbon fibers, which are also used again in like composites made used to make, incredibly light bicycles or whatever. Again, the aerospace industry has used them quite a bit. One of Millie's first graduate students helped discover and engineer smart concrete, which has carbon fibers in it, and it can sense strain. So, the applications are really interesting. One of Millie's biggest contributions early in her career or early in her work with nanotubes was along with Jean and a couple of other scientists. They discovered that the positioning of the atoms, depending on how they were, arranged, would affect the properties. It would affect how, magnetism would affect it. It would affect how, electricity would course through the nanotube and how conductive they could be. And this was not accepted at the time. Like originally, she was, when they put the papers through, people just didn't accept it. And when you're sort of not overturning, but when you're coming up with like a completely new way of thinking, there's a lot of there's skepticism, really. And so obviously Jean and her were later vindicated, but this was kind of a little bit of a revolutionary thinking here in terms of how conductivity could work and how the various properties might change depending on the arrangement of atoms. And that has come to be used in the development of different kinds of materials. So on the bottom left, you're just seeing a forest of carbon nanotubes that might be grown today. And then on the bottom right is like a nano wire or a nano string that they take. If you're sort of like zooming out a little bit from the forest, if you take these little individual pieces and start, weaving them together, you get this incredibly strong material that, is flexible and electrically conductive, but also lightweight and, a great use for many things. So Millie, focused a lot of her career on, she started with the fullerenes and then turned her attention to carbon nanotubes when they became, an area of interest and something that her graduate students and all her colleagues were working on. And later in the mid 2000s, in 2004, 2005, the individual layers of graphite were finally isolated and basically confirmed to exist in a way that was not just a conceptual thing, like they could actually work with them. And starting then, the number of papers that had to do with graphene, which is the dark solid line over here, really shot through the roof. And so Millie ultimately started focusing on that for the last part of her career. Graphene has become sort of the wonder material. At MIT, we're still constantly hearing about new discoveries with graphene that might be twisted on different layers or twisted. And if you get it at a very specific angle, you can change whether the material is, a superconductor or an insulator, which is a huge difference. And, Millie started working on this area, but, one of her colleagues who's still working on it really made the big discovery of these, bilayer twisted twistronics systems. And, we're still not really sure what the extent is going to ultimately be. But Millie was there at the beginning, laying the groundwork for these discoveries that are still being churned out. So I want to change gears a little bit to talk about her work in terms of supporting women and also, individuals of color and people who come from backgrounds that were not necessarily expected to go into research careers. So when Millie first joined the faculty, she knew that she wanted to give back in the sense that, she knew that her professorship was being funded as a way to encourage more women being on, academic spaces. And so one of the first things she did was to connect with this woman named Emily Wick, who was the first woman tenured at MIT in science. And they did a very interesting study of the MIT admissions process, which they recognized was being very unfair to women at the time. Very few women were being accepted, but they were all they all had to, have much better grades, much better recommendations. So they weren't on an even playing field. Basically, it was, in plain, it was easier for men to get into MIT than it was women. And so they started changing that. They made big recommendations after they did this study to the MIT administration to, do different things to encourage women to apply. Women finally in the 60s were able to have a dorm on campus. Originally, before that, they were sort of shunted off into this very small dorm in Boston, and there were only very few people who could actually live there. And that was literally the limiting factor of how many women could be accepted to MIT. So once they started realizing okay, we need to build a place for them, because of course couldn't possibly live together with men at that time. And so they built the women's dorm, and then it was so successful that they built another one. But they made it so that the requirements for admission were at the same or at least comparable. There were questions of like, well, should women be docked for not having such and such experiences? Like, if they're not afforded these experiences in high school, then that shouldn't be a penalty, And then she also, in the early 70s, helped form something called the MIT Women's Forum, which was sort of an avenue for people around the Institute to sort of bring about, just talk about issues and grievances about how people were being treated. MIT, the administration definitely was receptive in many ways in terms of like trying to encourage more supports for women. But, as with any kind of big change, women were not usually on college campuses prior to the 60s. And so, there were some rough patches. This was also a time of great civil strife. There was, the Vietnam War going on. Black communities were very rare on college campuses, and Millie was very encouraging of trying to get anyone who was interested in science to come do it. So she and Sheila Woodnall actually started a new introductory level class that became very popular called What is Engineering? And its aim was to help level the playing field for just incoming students, to give a little bit of background as to what engineering literally is, what are the opportunities, what are the subfields that you could potentially take part in. The idea was to really just, for those people who didn't have, let's say, a dad who had a shop in his garage, or an uncle who would take his son, who was interested in whatever, mechanics. If you didn't have those opportunities, this class would offer you a little bit of a way to catch up. And also really encourage people to consider taking either a full or a part major or a minor in engineering, in some kind of engineering. And, again, it was really popular, and it helps, having Millie was, a very visible leader. Female students would come to her, and Millie would say that, there are some students who are at risk of dropping out because they just were not being encouraged. They, in some cases, faced, just like biases that were not surmountable based on like their personalities and just the whole individual situation. And so she said that some students would come to her and they would feel so much better, and they didn't feel so alone, and they got the fortitude from her and some of the others that she was working with to continue and to graduate. So that was really important. And, she also, like later in her career, she continued supporting women at MIT. She also, when she was serving nationally as a leader in, let's say, the AAAS, so the American Academy, or sorry, I always confuse it with the other AAAS, but the Academy of Arts, which one is AAAS that I'm thinking about?
Arts and Science.
Arts and Science.
No, I'm thinking of.
AAAS is American Association for the Advancement.
That's
Advancement
right.
of Science.
So Foundation of the Advancement of Science. Also, when she was leading the American Physical Association, all of these things, she always took an opportunity to engage women around the country. She helped start a site visit program for physicists to sort of review the, situation in physics departments around the country, and make sure that, if there were glaring issues in terms of, women not being given opportunities or not being supported well enough, the people who would do the site visits would like quietly just say like, we think you can work on this, these are good, but like, here's some opportunities for you to improve in terms of being welcoming to women. And she did this, throughout her career. Later in her career at MIT, there was a program called Rising Stars, which basically would invite young career tenure track hopefuls essentially to discuss whatever their area was, whether it's electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, civil, physics, computer science. And they would have these workshops, and there was just discussion about ways to, manage things that sometimes are not talked about as openly, like dealing with wanting to start a family. How do you deal with childcare while you're, trying to earn tenure. I mean, these are difficult things. She was always very supportive in that way. And so she really became a beloved, figure on campus and of course also internationally or nationally. We'll talk about that more a little bit. I threw the Chronicle of Ed Higher Education clip on here just to note that in 1999, a group of scientists at MIT really did a study to kind of document the differences between how they were being treated versus what their male colleagues were being afforded. And Millie was not necessarily one of the instigators of this, although she was very supportive, and she ultimately was one of the people who signed a letter to the president at the time saying, you know what, we think there's a really big problem and we hope that you can let us study it a little bit more so we can make some recommendations on how to fix things. And so that was another way that she, quietly, but, she was a very major figure at that time. This was, again, 1999. So, coming towards the tail end of her career, supported women at the Institute. And, this ultimately changed things for women around the country as well. So I just show here that, she was constantly supporting women in her own research group as well. These are some of the faces of the people who graduated with her or worked under her as like postdocs and whatnot. We have, Jane Kong is currently still at MIT. Shirley Jackson was one of the, early students that connected with Millie, and they formed a bond and they remained friendly throughout her time there, and really throughout their lives. President Jackson, she's recently retired as the president of RPI, but she had a very similar career to Millie's as first a scientific researcher, and then she actually worked in government, and then ultimately came back to academia. And so, Shirley Jackson faced not only discrimination for being a woman, but also faced prejudice for being Black at a time when, again, students of color were almost invisible on college campuses. And Professor Jackson, when she was a student at MIT, did a lot to really help encourage more representation and support for students of color. On the right, I just show that Millie was inspiring women to the end of her life. This particular clip is actually from an advertisement that General Electric ran in 2017, right around the time that Millie died. Millie had, filmed the ad, I guess, in the year before, and the ad was sort of pretending that she was this science celebrity, like in the same vein as like a sports star or an A-list singer. And so they kind of followed her around, and the conceit was, what if we treated women in science as we treat other celebrities? Like, how would things change? And maybe we should do that, and maybe we should encourage women more. And ultimately, it's still an ad for GE, but it did really well. I mean, it was sort of went viral on social media briefly, and it was probably the most people had ever heard of her was through that ad, because many people who had nothing to do with science saw her in that moment. It was aired during the Oscars, again, shortly after she died. And so, it was just a really, truly fitting encapsulation of, just her influence. As I mentioned, she spent a lot of time, going around the country and being a representative of various science and engineering entities. At the left, she was actually tapped by President Clinton to head the Department of Energy Office of Science. So this is her confirmation swearing in, and she was only, and then she's there with Jean. And you can actually also see Ernie Moniz, who would later become the Secretary of Energy, sitting there. He was a professor at MIT. It still is. She only was there for about a year because this was at the very end of Clinton's term. And of course, it takes some time for Senate confirmation to happen. But even though she was there for a short amount of time, she was really interested in helping, some policy changes and at least thinking about certain new directions those things get passed. She was known for really encouraging opportunities for young people in science. And I don't mean kids necessarily, but I mean like young researchers to have leadership positions so that we don't have as much of a problem with gaps in knowledge. So when people who have experience, let's say, leading a NASA mission somewhere, and they go off and retire, and then we'll want to do another NASA mission to another planet, or maybe to the same planet 20 years later. Well, the ideas that she wanted to espouse, and that she kind of got from, Enrico Fermi earlier when she was a student, was to encourage making sure that young people were included so that there would be a continuation of leadership skills and knowledge. And that was one thing that she focused on. And on the right here is a trick from that time when she visited Fermi Lab. And I mentioned a quip in the book that, some student or some researcher who was there was feeling down on herself and just, or just had a hard week or whatever it was. And she said, Dr. Dresselhaus came to visit us this week and it was like going to group therapy. I feel so energized and ready to go. And Millie just had that way about her, like, focusing on the positive, seeing what you can do next, and, really, try to change the world with your science or your engineering or whatever you're working on. I wanted to show a brief, this is an awesome, and I use that word sparingly, but I truly believe that this is an awesome graphic encapsulation of Millie's, her touch around the world. This is actually a graphic that was created by one of her former postdocs, Mario Hoffman, who decided to take it upon himself to quantify all of her research collaborations. Now, not every person is mentioned here because there are something like 5,000 nodes apparently, or 5,000 connections. Only the most common, and these are connections on her research papers, her co-collaborations. So she had an incredible number of research papers. Most people, will be happy with like 100 or 200 papers in their career. She had like in thousands, or she had like, I think it was 1,700, which is pretty incredible. But one of the things that I think is really remarkable about this picture is that, the people are very international, and you wouldn't necessarily know that just from looking at it, but only a few of these people that are here are from MIT. Almost all the rest of them are from other places, and many of them are from around the world. She collaborated with people in every time zone, and I heard stories about her, turning things around in the middle of the night so that her collaborator in Japan would have it, first thing. And then, she had this whole system set up where, before email, and even when there was email, she would like make it so that she could, squeeze every second of every day so that nobody was wasting time and the work was continued. So I thought this was just a great encapsulation of that. So Millie won many, many awards over her career. She never won a Nobel Prize, but she was not concerned about that at all. She frankly was just happy to be furthering science. That was her ultimate goal. And to receive recognition was certainly nice, but she never was like a prize go-getter or anything. She earned something like 40 honorary degrees throughout her life. Some of her big prizes include this is her winning the Kavli Prize in 2012. She was the first person, man or woman, to win the Kavli Prize as a solo recipient. So she won it in the nanoscience category for her work in carbon systems and all the other systems that she worked in. And what else did she win? She was the first woman in the category of engineering to win the National Medal of Science. Of course, at the beginning, I showed you her winning the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Those are some of the big ones. She won the L'Oreal Women in Science Award, which was meaningful for her because, of course, she really spent a lot of her career trying to encourage women. That's an international award. So, she really was well known, like I said, within the science community, and just certainly very well beloved. At the time of her death, MIT Nano, a new, wonderful, beautiful, and highly technical, new nanoscience facility and nanotechnology facility in the heart of MIT was being built. So she didn't see its full completion, but she was definitely there when it was being started, and certainly when the designs were up. And you know, she had been pushing for this kind of thing for a long time, and was very happy that MIT was going to be taking this on. This walkway that you see here is actually named in her honor. It's called the Improbability Walk, and the idea is, you know, Millie always thought that it was very improbable for her to come from such humble beginnings to become this highly influential scientist who had a very remarkable career. And part of the reason why she feels that she was able to do that, a large part, is that people took a chance on her, people encouraged her despite problems of society, despite her family backgrounds and things of this nature. And so the idea is, you know, to sort of recreate those walks she used to take with Enrico Fermi. It's not such a huge distance here, frankly, but, you know, the idea is, you know, if you have a chance to sit with your young student, or, you know, a young postdoc who's newly in your lab, take a moment to listen to them, see what they're working on, listen to their problems, and see if you can steer them in the right direction. And so there's a plaque on the end of this that talks about Millie. So we definitely remember her at MIT very much. Just a brief note about my connection with Millie. I only met Millie one time. I saw her a couple of times in the hall, but you know, I was too shy to actually say anything other than hello. But so one of my hobbies is making Lego minifigures that are customized to look like actual scientists and engineers. And I had done this well before I joined the MIT community, and I had actually made one of Millie. And so when I joined the MIT news office in 2014, I knew that before long I would want to reach out to Millie and ask her if I could come by and just give her her minifigure. And so I did, and I figured that would take like 5 minutes. So our offices actually happened to be very close to each other. So I just walked down there, and she welcomed me so graciously into her office. And you know, I was a little starstruck even then, and I certainly would never have envisioned, you know, writing a book about her at that time. I had known about her briefly when I was a reporter at Discover magazine. I had done I was the fact checker on an article about 50 best women in science in 2002. And in so researching, you know, I had probably emailed with her just to confirm we had everything correct or whatever. So I knew who she was. And when I got to MIT, I learned a little bit more about her just because we were publishing articles about her work well into her 80s. But, you know, she was so nice, and we talked about both being from New York and being interested in women in science. And honestly, I don't remember a whole lot more than that because, you know, as one does when you meet someone that you're in awe of, you kind of just, everything leaves your brain. But she was super warm, and she ended up putting the minifigure with like all of these major awards that she got. It was like, you know, very, very humbling to have that in there. She actually told me when I first emailed her, I introduced myself and I said, oh, would you be okay with me coming over and just, you know, giving you this thing? And she's like, oh, yes. You know, I have a photograph of that printed out on my bulletin board right now, and it has been attracting attention. So yes, by all means, please come down. So like she actually knew about this thing before I even told her about it. So that was cool. So when I made the book, I was asked by colleagues at the MIT Press shortly after she died if I would be interested in writing about a woman in science, and I was given a few opportunities, a few people to consider that they were thinking about. And Millie definitely jumped out at me as the one I wanted to write about. And so I, you know, worked on that. It was definitely a long process, but once we were finally done and ready to publish, I knew that I wanted to do something to sort of commemorate like our one meeting, and also it, you know, giving out these little minifigures that we ultimately, the MIT Press did help me make through a third-party company, has been fun. You know, people might not want to buy the book, but they'll be happy to take a Lego. So that's really my talk. I have no idea if I've gone over time because I can't see on here, but this is a picture of Millie and Jean. Jean Dresselhaus passed away a couple of years ago. So Millie died in 2017 in February. She, had a very long and wonderful life. Jean died in, I think, September of 2001, I believe. So they're buried together at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And my, family and I go and visit them every now and then. And they've certainly had a big role in my life now that I've written this book. And thank you for listening. And I would love to hear any stories, questions, happy to answer anything. Yeah.
Thank you.
Was she ever involved, there are currently man-made diamonds called.
So they're diamonds.
She ever involved in any of that,
I would guess probably not. But I don't know for sure. I would have to look at her CV. I will say an interesting note though is that actually her family from Europe was in the diamond trading business. So she actually has carbon in her family going back. But I don't think that I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that she did not work in synthetic diamonds. Yeah.
Hey, Steve, you want to take down the spotlight and we can see everybody? If
I'm
you
gonna,
don't mind?
yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen too.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
When, after she died, I was part of organizing a memorial for her in the American Association of Physics Teachers. And one of the slides that somebody brought showed her in bed with two grandchildren, one sort of under each arm, and the physical review.
Yes. Yes, she told a story in one, I can't remember where I found it, but it's in the book where, she took her briefcase to go have children at the hospital. Like she brought her work with her to go into labor. And yeah, I mean, she was definitely a workaholic and she admitted it. And she said at some point, like, maybe this is like a slightly unhealthy level of being a scientist, but if this is unhealthy, I don't want to be healthy. Like she had Gene there and he was similarly in the same vein. And yeah, I mean, it was her passion. Also, and I didn't mention too much about this, but later in her life, she continued to play music, and music was such a huge, as you guys were saying before, it was a way to talk to people, and it was like a common language, as science is in many ways, but knowing music is another sort of secret language that if you share with people, you kind of get to know them. And she would have musicians come to the beginning of a seminar, and that was something that was done regularly that had never been done before at MIT. So she was really good about mixing her work and her other pursuits. She apparently didn't have too many other hobbies, frankly, because she was just so focused on science and her music. But yeah. She had 4 kids, although they did eventually grow up, and so she still remains, laser focused.
In fact, your granddaughter is a physicist.
Yes, she has 5 grandchildren, and I think several of them are in some form of science. Her granddaughter Leora was actually a chemistry PhD student at MIT. And she didn't work in Millie's area, but she definitely spent time with Millie. That was one of the draws of bringing her to MIT. She was considering a number of places and felt, I won't really understand my grandma Millie if I don't really see her in her place of work, because we all know in this family that like her work is her life in a lot of ways. So that was a really, Leora was the one who encouraged her to do the GE ad. She was like, you need, if you want to reach the next generation, like our generation, this is the medium for that. But yes, I think some of her other granddaughters are also in science, and mathematics or applied mathematics, or I think one of them is in psychology. So yes, she's obviously inspired, not only people all over the world, but in her own family to go into science. Yeah.
Ted, do you have a question?
If she was involved with the beginning of the undergraduate research opportunities program at MIT, because I found that to be actually the most valuable thing that I did while I was at MIT as an undergraduate. And I thought that was sort of unique from a standpoint of other people I've met. Yeah, there was occasionally programs, but not on the scale of the MIT program. So I was wondering if she had a hand in putting that together.
That's a great question. I don't know whether, so Margaret McVicker was really the driving force behind the Europe program that you're talking about. But I would be shocked if Millie didn't have some hand in it as well. Millie absolutely encouraged young people to come and study in labs, including undergraduates. She would actually bring her own sons into her lab, which was super unheard of, and have them do stuff, like not just to sit around and do their homework on the side. They would actually participate. And so, again, as I mentioned, she really tried to encourage this like familial atmosphere in the lab, and that was not done at that time. There's actually a historian of science that I met through writing this book.
I would just say John King
Yeah.
always told me that it was Ed Lamb
Okay.
who came and spent a year at MIT,
Mhm.
and it was he who kind of instigated the earliest forms of Europe.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure there are a number of people. I feel like McVicker is one of the people whose name is kind of associated with the program.
She became the force that made it actually.
Exactly.
work. But I think the
Ed
original
Lamb,
idea,
okay.
there was some opposition. The faculty
I'm
were
sure.
saying, I don't want undergraduates messing up my research. And it turns out, actually, they don't.
Yeah, so in terms of Millie's participation in that, I'm really not sure exactly if she was formally part of it, but I would be surprised if she wasn't involved in some way.
Because my closest association actually with kind of things she did, I never I saw her at a couple of functions, but I never actually encountered her personally. But when MIT had an open house, the lab I was working in building 20 was working with transverse excitement atmospheric CO2 lasers.
Mhm.
And we wanted to show off these lasers to the crowd of people coming from the outside world. And one of the things we could do with the lasers was, well, you could produce a little fireball by breaking down air with a mirror to concentrate the energy from the laser. But if you didn't do that, if you just took a piece of paper and scribbled on it with a pencil and fired the laser at the paper, you would explode the carbon nanotubes and buckyballs and whatever else was produced by the explosion of the graphite sheets that were laid down on the paper by the pencil, and it produced a fascinating little explosion and left a little imprint where the laser had hit, and the people liked that. So we carefully scribbled MIT using the pencil and then blew it up.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like some of Millie's early experiments. So it sounds like you were recreating them for public education. That's pretty cool.
I have a question for
Yeah.
you. How did you get to be a science writer?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. Well, when I was in college, I originally thought I would do astronomy, and then I decided that I wasn't sure that was going to be the right career, and I kind of lost my support in that area. So I was a little bit looking for another area that I might want to focus in. I thought maybe I might want to do biology, and I did ultimately major in human biology with a focus on the evolution of race and gender. And I still didn't think I was sure I wanted that to be my full career. So it's a very weird situation, but I actually at a certain point wanted to go into art school. And I thought, I'm going to just completely change gears here. And so I got an internship that was supposed to be an art internship at Scholastic, which is a kids publishing company.
Mhm.
And they accidentally put me in the wrong place. They put me at their children's science magazine, their like middle school level science magazine, which at first I was upset about, because I was like, the whole point of doing the internship was to see if I wanted to change my life and start working in art. But after like a week, I realized that actually I really enjoyed writing and editing about science, and I was really good at it. So that is how I originally came to science writing, and I've gone back and forth between writing and editing things for children, like little kids, versus, you know, higher education and adults.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you're right, for kids, you get a bigger audience. Most people understand it.
That's true. That's true. And I did write this book with a larger audience in mind, frankly. I did not go, I definitely went more in depth than, you know, you will get a little bit more detail than I went into in this talk. But I didn't go too much more beyond because I wanted it to be accessible to, like, let's say a high school chemistry or physics student.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Popular stuff, you have to do that. Understood.
absolutely. Yeah.
Understood.
A question here, my understanding is that the Nobel Prize for chlorine, was given to two guys, I don't remember their names, from another institute. What was the interaction of going on there for them to get it and her not to be recognized?
Okay, so there were actually two Nobels that were related. One was for the discovery of the buckyball, essentially.
That's what I'm talking about.
Right, so the second one was in 2010, I believe, and that was the two men from the University of, actually, I don't remember which university it was, but somewhere in the UK, Andre Geim and Konstantin Novosela. Yeah, they won for the isolation of graphene.
Right.
And so Millie played a large role in this discovery to the point where she was invited by one of the winners to come to the ceremony. She was mentioned by both in their, like, thank you acceptance speeches. But at the end of the day, and this is again another thing that I learned in doing this, because I frankly didn't know that much about the inner workings of how Nobel Prizes are given. You know, it really, I mean, there are some Nobel Prizes that are much more like lifetime achievement in this particular very specific area. But most of the time, it's really for an experiment or a set of experiments that established a new field or whatnot. And, you know, Millie was certainly played a supportive role, but at that point, many other people also had. So it's not like she alone had done an experiment that sort of pushed her over the top to be considered for this. So the duo that did win, and Millie wrote a history about this actually later. She was very much in support of them winning this, and she said it wasn't just one or two experiments. They really changed the paradigm. Like, it was a paradigm shift that they, you know, were at the head of, and they were kind of getting ahead of graphene science in a way that, you know, differentiated them from everybody else. So even though, you know, she did play a significant role in that Nobel and she didn't win it, she still, you know, we can thank her for doing that. And frankly, you know, who knows? Like, I think there's a pretty good chance that, you know, her colleague, Pablo Herrera, who's at MIT now, who basically his group led the discovery of twistronics. You know, like Millie was working on that too at the end of her career, and it wasn't called twistronics then, but, you know, it could be possible that there will be another Nobel Prize someday, given that she somehow contributed to. So stay tuned.
Did you see that I think just this week, they're announcing, you know, giant magnetoresistance in sheets of graphene.
Interesting. I didn't see that
It's
one.
another sort of surprise.
I mean, I saw that there were at least a couple more allotropes that have been discovered in the last year. And every time I see them, I just get happy. There's one where at least one of the lead scientists was a woman also, and she's on Twitter and she was, you know, putting it out there. And it's nice to see that, you know, her legacy is continuing not only in her students, but around the world. So yeah, we'll see.
Ted, hang on a second, Dan.
Yeah, Millie became president of the American Physical Society,
Yeah.
sometime in the late 70s or early 80s.
80s, yeah.
She was a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering.
Correct.
She was in a group really doing materials science. Now, the physics department is also very interested in materials science, but we call it condensed matter physics.
Right.
And we were suddenly rather embarrassed that the president of the American Physical Society wasn't a member of the physics department.
Yeah.
Now, I was actually chairing that section of the department. We we have never made a more rapid. She is now also a professor.
Yeah. I should have interviewed you for my book. I mentioned that actually in the book. And I, I talked to a couple of people who knew her well, including her assistant at the time, who, nobody knew for sure, but that was the assumption that because she became president, she was elected to the presidential line, and yet she wasn't on the physics department of her own university, that, yes, that would be a smart thing to do. Good.
Yes. and
Make the
looking at
appointment
it,
for the second edition of the book.
This is just another example of discrimination against women.
Yeah.
It didn't occur to us that she was doing physics.
Right. And it was a little bit unusual. I mean, she wasn't an engineer, and the lines between material science, I mean, there's now a material science department that is separate from electrical engineering department. And there's condensed matter physicists in physics, and there's folks in the chemistry department working on this stuff. So, I mean, part of it is just, I mean, I appreciate your owning up to it, and that's, very much appreciated. But at the same time, also another thing to consider is that when she was originally brought on, as you probably know, like the physics department was really focused on like nuclear physics, essentially, like high energy physics. And Millie was not working on high energy physics at that time. So it was a little bit of an unusual placement when she first started in electrical engineering, but things morphed and shifted, and it did make a lot of sense ultimately. So we appreciate your, adding her second appointment there, and I'm sure.
So
She
it's,
also told me that the reason for her appointment was musical.
Oh, okay.
That at Lincoln Labs,
Mhm.
she was in a group which liked music and had either a quartet or a quintet, and she was the violinist.
Right.
And when the director of the group moved to MIT, he wanted to bring his musical associates along.
Nice.
And she said that she was brought along really because she could play the violin.
That's good. Yeah, I did hear about that, and I'm not sure if that was like the primary reason, but certainly that played a role. And I didn't mention in the book, I mentioned that she was connected with and now I'm blanking on his name, sorry. Von Hippel, I think was her fellow. She was a colleague, but also encouraged her violin playing. So yeah, I'm telling you, the violin thing. I mean, when she was at the Cavendish in the UK, she played music there and really got to know a lot of people and made a lot of friends that way. As her former assistant said, there was the daytime calendar and the nighttime calendar, and the nighttime calendar was her musical schedule essentially, and that was just as sacred to her as the daytime calendar. So I think that spoke volumes about, her value of music. And seeing her grandchildren also, I have pictures of them, learning, and Millie teaching them. There's one in the book where her granddaughter's learning violin, and sort of mirrors another picture of the book where, a black and white picture when she's teaching her own son. So it's just very clear that music is huge in their family. Very important. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Ted has a question.
Yep.
Yes. You're muted, Ted.
I'm sorry, unmuted. I was muted, unmuted. Okay, so I was always sort of surprised in a sense, or maybe dismayed in a fashion that carbon, which we've known about in various forms for a very long time, we never really looked at it very seriously, and it's only now that we find out how easy it is to make all these various weird carbon structures, that whenever you burn a candle flame, for instance, you produce all kinds of these things on anything that the soot falls on. And you take a piece of Scotch tape and you can peel off a graphene layer from just a pencil scribble on a kind of pencil. Did she ever look at these things from that sort of historic, we missed this opportunity kind of perspective at all?
I think she did. I mean, she actually was very fond of writing historical reviews of where we are. I mean, she wrote a number of books. She had like 8 books. And, some of them were, I mean, they all were pretty technical, but she also wrote reviews that appeared in magazines that were more on the popular side that, took a look back on the field and talk about what things might have been missed. I mean, she also talked about, frankly, when graphene was isolated, there were, scientists who started recreating some of the work that she had done in the 60s and 70s, using newer technology, of course. And so, yeah, like she used to say that she would throw out the Scotch tape when they would do that in the 60s, but they weren't doing it to isolate the graphene and study it from the tape. They were just doing it to like get a smooth surface, I guess. So I think she did look back quite a bit, and I've heard that at conferences, she would be the one who would always sort of wrap up and like, okay, what did we learn here today? What are we going to think about for the next conference? So I really do, I think she felt, that history of science was an important thing. And that's why she was one of the reasons why she enjoyed writing and working with Jean to create manuscripts that, would last the test of time, I guess. So it was an honor to work on this book in that sense. I mean, obviously she's not with us, so I couldn't ask her questions or anything, and the other thing to know is my book is relatively short just due to contractual obligations, and I actually submitted it with 20,000 words over, and I was really afraid they were gonna cut it, but thankfully they let everything stand. So, but still, it's relatively short. I mean, there's so many other things in Millie's life and also in the history of carbon science that could have been included.